Yeah, I just want to thank you for being a part of the conversation. Let's do some pod crashing. Episode number 328 is with Caroline Cole and Rebecca Mellinger from the podcast Trapped in Treatment.
We're great. How are you doing?
Absolutely fantastic. I knew last year when you and I talked, the three of us, that we were going to do this again. And I'm just so glad and so proud of you for going on with season 2 of Trapped in Treatment.
Thank you. We're so excited to be back and share more about what we've learned and the state of the troubled teen industry today.
Well, one of the things that the two of you keep bringing up, and that is, and it's becoming a part of the conversation, is you're making us aware of situations. For instance, like these people who prey upon parents saying they can help their babies. I see this more than just in institutions. I see this in martial arts schools. I see it in all these things where, we can make your child, stronger, and they get trapped into doing these things.
Absolutely. I mean, that pervasiveness of kind of manipulation, in a sense, can impact so many different people. I mean, not just the troubled teen industry, but you take, long-term adult care. And there are so many different ways that, systemic institutional abuse can relate to families. And we always like to say that, the troubled teen industry can impact every single community in our nation. And it really is the case because they're preying on vulnerable families during a time of need, and getting kids into their care.
Yeah. Provo Canyon School. This can't be the only one in this nation.
There are actually thousands of facilities just like Provo Canyon School. And that's something that we cover in Trapped in Treatment. Is really, we wanted to do an analysis of kind of the history, right? How did this industry get started? Yep. Who were the major players? And what are the stories of real people who were there? And how has it gone on to impact their lives? And so in season 2, we've extended that journey with an organization called WASP. And WASP actually, its creator started at Provo Canyon School, and then he went on to open over 26 different programs across the world, as far as Samoa, to the Czech Republic, to Mexico, and all throughout the United States.
I can't imagine sitting in a room with you during a meeting of each one of these podcasts, because when you start uncovering the truth, the two of you looking at each other and with your directors and producers and coming up with how are we going to make this into a podcast where we can keep the attention of listeners. I mean, it's got to be so dynamic.
It is. I mean, the stories are really, really shocking, and we're obviously embedded into these stories and hearing these, every single day as we work to create, a piece of investigative journalism and entertainment, but also as we push for policy change. So not only are, the folks that are willing to share their stories on Trapped in Treatment and through all of our media opportunities sharing their story, but they're also working alongside us at the capitals where they're able to share their stories with the hopes that we can, promote change, whether that be state or federal policy change, or introducing them to legal assistance so that they can seek justice that way. Like we said, there are facilities in every single state. In North Carolina, there was just a child who unfortunately died. He was 12. He had been transported from New York that day, and that night he was placed in a restraining device where I believe he, ended up not being able to breathe, and he had a mental health crisis overnight. And when, he woke up that morning after not being checked on for many, many hours, he was found dead. And so, I mean, can you imagine a family who is trying to do the best that they can for their child, and then they get a call that they died in these facilities at the hands of these operators? And so, we really want to use these personal stories and these allegations to not only tell them and create entertainment out of it, but to really impact change so that no more children are trapped in treatment, are abused in treatment, or die in the name of treatment.
You're starting the conversation. That's the thing about it. And landing these conversations is a big thing. And one of the things I love about the two of you is the fact that you're not just podcasters, you're activators. You want those policies to be changed. You're physically getting involved in this.
We are. It's a daily effort at 1111 Media Impact, which is the organization that Paris, Caroline, and I run. We are taking these stories. We're looking at the landscape of, the regulatory structure and the licensing structure across every single state. We're looking at where children are being sent from, which states have more facilities than others, and investigating why that is. And then we're looking at, how can we increase protections for children in these facilities? How can we make sure that the licensing offices in every single state are doing their due diligence and are checking on these facilities and asking the right questions so that we can end up getting to the bottom of what really needs to be solved? And so we are at the helm of that. And we always recommend that those with lived experience are the ones promoting change, because who knows it best than those that have lived it?
When you hear the name Robert Litchfield, I can't imagine what goes through your imagination immediately.
I personally feel somewhat sick to my stomach when I hear that name. Yeah. This is the guy who actually owned the program that I went to when I was a teenager. And I was at that program for 29 months. And during that time was not allowed to talk, was not allowed to move, was not allowed to get up and go get a book off the bookshelf. And so my every single movement for 2.5 years was absolutely under the highest scrutiny and control. And, let me just tell you firsthand, that will do something to you over time. And so we really explore his story through season 2 and how he came to operate this kind of monolithic entity that would really go down in history as being one of the most notorious troubled teen organizations in the world.
One of the things that you guys cover in season 2 of Trapped in Treatment is, we all cringe when we see these PSAs, public service announcements on TV with dogs in cages, humans in cages, the abuse, the burnings. My God. You've got the guts to put this out there.
Absolutely. For so long, these survivors weren't believed because, these facilities would get ahead of the treatment and they would say, your kid is going to say that they're being abused, that they're being sexually abused, that they're hurt, by being restrained by staff members, but they're lying. They're manipulating just to get out of these programs. And I think we're at a place now, finally, thank God, that people are hearing these stories and they're absolutely believing them. And so, when we go through instances of children being held in dog cages or not being able to speak, being held in solitary confinement, away from their families for years, these stories are true. And Robert Litchfield set out to create, in their own family words, the McDonald's of teen treatment. This is a for-profit industry with a franchise model that was really aiming to, get parents in at their most vulnerable state and keep kids in their care as long as humanly possible.
You're stirring up so many memories because, I was in a place where if I made a mistake, I had to go sit in the corner holding a brick above my head. And the pain that you go through, you don't forget anything like that. And you're trying to figure out how do I become perfect? And did you go through that as well? It's like, how do I make myself good again?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually just speaking with another survivor the other day about this exact thing, because when you are held to that level of structure and discipline 24 hours a day, ultimately it creates this kind of psychological effect where you feel like you're always being watched. You're always doing something wrong. You're always, and of course, none of that's true. At the program that I was at, the Academy at Ivy Ridge, we would get in trouble if we accidentally knocked our water bottle over, or if our shoulder touched the wall as we were walking by. So I just want to emphasize that this is not bad behavior. This is just structure to an insane degree.
But I think you bring up such an important point, too, because, what is the goal of sending a kid into these programs? Yep. We know that there is strict behavior modification that's happening. And so they're trying to get these children to comply. And that's the only way to get out of these programs. But if a child is entering one of these facilities due to a mental health crisis or due to a behavior that, the parents deem inappropriate, we really should be asking, what is the root cause of that?
Yeah.
Why is a child exhibiting this behavior? But instead, when they enter these programs, it's all about kind of slapping a Band-Aid on that behavior instead of getting to that root cause. And so we'd really love to switch that model in a sense of focusing on the actual care and mental health needs of the children instead of focusing on behavior modification as the route to kind of seeming fixed. But on the inside, we know that kids are leaving these facilities worse than when they went in.
Isn't it odd that we have to go through such bad experiences personally before we can go out and become better listeners to a community that needs our help?
Yeah, I mean, these survivors have really been telling their stories for decades. And I remember when I first got out of the program and I would tell people what happened to me, the response was always the same. And people would kind of chuckle and they'd go, so you were a bad kid, weren't you?
Oh, my God.
Were you bad? Were you rebellious? Were you... And there's so much more to my story that people didn't know. And that's really what we see with a lot of these survivors, especially kids now who are entering these facilities for no other reason than maybe they had a parent die and they entered the child welfare system. Or maybe they have a learning disability and they were sent through the special education system.
Yep. A lot of these teens, are they talking themselves into the darkness? Because it just seems like that it's like, when you hear the story, you're going, how, who, what, where, why, when, and how, and then you find out they're going into an institution. You're going, okay, now we've got more questions, but nobody wants to give you answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these stories are shocking by nature. You hear them and you're like, wait a second, how could that happen and no one was arrested? How could that happen? And people just got away with it, or there were adults who were doing it to these kids. I mean, it's hard to believe. But I think, in today's world, it's like there's so much stuff that happens that's hard to believe that it actually, really kind of starts to make sense as to, there's just so much money involved in these facilities and they have so much power locally. Wherever they are, usually in small rural areas where they bring in a lot of money. They're able to make political contributions and they have a lot of social clout. And so, no one's going to want to believe that those same people are responsible for these horrific things that are being done to kids.
How do you think the game is going to change now that two parents are going to prison because their son shot up a school? I think that when you look into the stories that you've got on Trapped in Treatment, that those parents need to be held accountable as well.
We do hope that, parents are held accountable if they're knowingly placing kids in facilities where abuse is happening. But we also hope that the facilities are held accountable too. They are licensed and accredited by their state to provide treatment for children. And there's been far too many stories and investigations that have happened into, shedding light on the fact that these facilities are keeping kids longer than medically necessary, that they're billing for services that aren't even needed for these kids, that they're giving these children diagnoses that they don't have. I mean, at one program in Utah, they're basically blanket diagnosing all of these different children so that they can medicate them, so that they can bill their insurance and so forth. And so, it really is very, very fraudulent, and states and facilities should be held accountable. If you're placing kids from the child welfare system through the juvenile justice system or children with disabilities in these facilities, I want the world to know that, taxpayer dollars are going to this treatment. And given that's the case, we need to make sure that these facilities, if they're saying that they're providing treatment, that they're held accountable to doing so. And so, stories like Trapped in Treatment help us to digest what the troubled teen industry is, to really, highlight the fraudulent and opaqueness of the industry. And then with these stories, we then go to legislators and policymakers and those, stakeholders at the table within state government and within the licensing bodies to show them what we've found and hope that they will take, the necessary and appropriate action.
Yeah, I was just going to add something to that really quickly. So to give kind of a preview of some of the stories that you're going to hear in season 2 of Trapped in Treatment, at one point, WASP owned or was contracted with this hospital called Brightway Adolescent Hospital. And they ended up being investigated by the state. And it was reported that they found these documents where it was just a form template letter where every single child was diagnosed with the same thing. Every single child was then referred on to one of WASP's programs. So Brightway became kind of this intake center to pipeline these kids then into facilities that were overseas. So they would take them from this facility in Utah and send them to places like Samoa or places like Jamaica. And so they had really operationalized this business model. And so kind of just speaking to those blanket diagnoses, that's very much a tenet of what we address here in season 2.
Oh my God, you just triggered me, because when kids are forced to travel, that's human trafficking. That's a whole completely different thing here.
It absolutely is. And it's actually something that we will, begin to investigate at the end of this season. And I think you're going to see a lot more of us, in relation to that. But we are aware that there are facilities over international borders as well. Paris and myself, we were just in Jamaica dealing with a child abuse case related to a facility called Atlantis Leadership Academy that was housing 7 American boys in Jamaica until they turned 18. And so there absolutely is aspects of human trafficking as it relates to this industry, because you're taking children across state borders, across international borders, where they're being forced to, perform labor on behalf of these facilities. And these children deserve treatment. They deserve an education. And unfortunately, because these are, for-profit lockdown type facilities, the world really doesn't know what's happening behind closed doors unless facility owners, former employees, or students are willing to come out and talk about the abuse that they experienced. So, it really can go on for such a long time. But I do feel like we're really at a reckoning within, the nation right now, where these stories are being heard, they're being listened to, and folks feel, a lot more confidence to share their stories with their community and with the world on social media, as well as obviously with their lawmakers, like I've said previously. So I don't think the facilities are going to be able to get away with this, but, it shouldn't take a death at a facility like it took at Trails in North Carolina to shut a facility down. There should be a lot more standards in place so that we don't have to get to a place where we're only taking action if there has been a death.
You talk about placing teens inside these institutions. My granddaughter volunteered to go in, and they said just 3 days. 3 days became 1 week, became 2 weeks. I was freaking out. Because in listening to season number 1, I'm going, no, this has got to move. We've got to get her out of there as soon as possible.
Yeah, even in my story, which we also showcase in this season, and my mom shares her story for the very first time from her perspective, which is really interesting. But, I was excited to go. I thought I was going to a boarding school that was going to be like college. I was going to make friends. Yeah. We were going to have slumber parties and paint each other's nails. And I also knew that our family needed help at that time. And so it was absolutely jarring to walk into a facility that was more like a quasi kid prison than it was any kind of a treatment center. And, they really exploited my mom. I stayed there for 2.5 years, not because I needed it, but because they knew that my mom would pay for it.
Oh my God.
And that's the real reality of what we're seeing here.
Well, I love where your heart is. I'm glad that you continue to push forward with this, because we've got to get it into the conversations. That's the only way we're going to make changes. You got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you. So I expect to talk to you in season 3.
We absolutely will come back. And thank you so much for sharing parts of your story, too. It matters so much when there's just, different touch points about different experiences and how, this industry is really, really relatable.
It is. Please be brilliant today.
We'll do our best. Thank you for having us.